Archbishop Tobin writes, many members of religious institutes will recognize themselves in the reflections of Father Billy, who offers a clear-eyed view of our struggles over the last 4 or 5 decades. The author avoids useless polemic, preferring instead to situate religious life among the other vocations in the church, and indicates how religious can live their unique vocation in a spirit of communion. The book is an excellent tool for the initial and ongoing formation of religious women and men, as well as a reliable voice for all those who want to understand better how this religious life is to be lived today. And Sister Elia Delio, Franciscan sister, senior fellow of Woodstock Theological Center, writes, religious life is not a naive utopia, there's that as the first but a commitment to live in the gap between vision and reality, the already and the not yet, the place where human relationships are deepened in the midst of human frailties. This is a well-written and thought-provoking book which will raise questions for some and provide insight for many. Living in the Gap offers a wise and spiritual foundation for those seeking the pearl of great price. Father Denis.
Thank you, Bishop Senior, for your kind words. We postponed this occasion one time because of Hurricane Sandy, and now we're in the midst of the nor'easter. Thank you all for coming and showing up this evening. I'd like to begin actually by having a moment of quiet where we can pray for all those who are affected by the superstorm during the past week, all along the Delaware Valley, the New Jersey shore, and especially New York, where I come from. The neighborhood I grew up with, faced a lot of destruction and loss of human life, and people were more than just without power. So if we just have a few moments of quiet. Our Mother of Perpetual Help.
Pray for us.
Many of you probably know that some 2.5 years ago I was hit by another type of storm, one of a very different sort, a life-threatening illness known as ALL, acute lymphocytic leukemia. And during that time, I spent over 8 months in a hospital and went through an intense regimen of chemotherapy treatments at Lincoln Medical Center here in Philadelphia, and also at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. And about a year ago, underwent a bone marrow transplant, or to be more precise, a procedure known as an adult stem cell transplant. And I'm standing before you this evening because of the miracles of modern medicine, the wonderful care I received from my doctors and nurses, and because of the countless prayers of so many people the world over who stood by me during those dark and troubling times. In a special way, I would like to thank my brothers and sisters, their spouses, and my nieces and nephew for their countless sacrifices, both big and small, that they made for me as I went through this ordeal. And I would also like to thank my Redemptorist confreres in Philadelphia, and throughout my province, and the entire world for their constant prayers and support. And in a special way, I would like to thank faculty and seminarians and staff of St. Charles Seminary for standing by me during what was, without a doubt, the most difficult time of my life. Words cannot express the deep sense of gratitude I have to everyone who has journeyed with me during my illness. And from the depths of my heart, I wish to say thank you. I have received so much from you, and you have taught me a great deal about the mystery of God's love, the power of prayer, what it means to be a member of the body of Christ. And you have also given me a concrete example of what it means to live the spirituality of communion, the topic of this book presentation this evening. And as I begin this evening, there's one thing I want to say to all of you. It's good to be back. This evening I would like to present to you a small book with deep roots in my past. It is a collection of articles written over the years for the journals Review for Religious and Dominican Ashram that I edited during the early stages of my illness and have entitled Living in the Gap, Religious Life and the Call to Communion. Now don't let the title, Living in the Gap, give you the wrong impression. I don't want you all running to the local mall, to that well-known retail clothing store, The Gap, asking to see their new line of habits for women in their religions. And I certainly don't want you to live there. I don't even necessarily want you to visit there. I don't think the proprietors of The Gap are interested in getting into the religious habit market. When I came up with the title, Living in the Gap, I had something very different in mind. I wanted to address how religious today can bridge the gap between the ideal and the real, between the vision of what their vocation to living the evangelical counsels of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and the way they fall short of this vision in the concrete reality of their everyday lives. How do we close the distance between them? How do we narrow the gap? How do we lift our sights to what can be and not be skeptical about making the ideal an incarnate reality in our everyday lives? Now, some of you may be thinking that is a very tall order for such a thin book. And it is very thin, maybe 110 pages. How could you say anything substantial in 100 or so pages? By the time your book is finished, some authors would just be getting started. My response to this objection comes from something written more than 50 years ago by a scholar named John Beavers, who in the introduction to his translation of Abandonment to Divine Providence by Jean-Pierre de Caussade wrote the following: "Short books often have great power. A few that come to mind are Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, The Communist Manifesto, Paine's The Rights of Man, Rousseau's Social Contract, St. Therese's The Story of a Soul, and of course, the Gospels. There is a very human reason for this. Most people have neither the time nor the inclination to plow through a 5-volume treatise. They want the message, whatever it is, given to them in as few pages as possible. This is no new phenomenon. Pamphlets may not give as much enjoyment as a many-volumed book, but it is arguable that they have had vastly more influence. And it is not only the reader who is affected by a short book, its writer is. The effort, whether conscious or not, to concentrate his thought in 100 or so pages instead of 1,000 gives this thought a sharpness and urgency which would inevitably be diffused in many volumes. Now, I don't in any way wish to give the impression that I am placing my slim volume in the same category with Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, or St. Therese's The Story of the Soul, or much less the Gospels. To do so would be the height of pretentiousness and go against the simplicity and humble witness that religious life seeks to embody. At the same time, the book I am presenting this evening focuses on a very important topic for the life of the church: the relationship between religious life and the spirituality of communion. The latter being one of the most vibrant and visible expressions of Catholic spirituality in the post-Vatican II era. And there is value in giving a succinct presentation of its major themes to a general reading audience. This is not merely because the spirituality of communion has special significance for religious, but also because it is meant to be practiced by everyone, regardless of their vocation or state in life. One of the best descriptions of this spirituality comes from Pope John Paul II in his apostolic letter on the new millennium, Novo Millennio Inuente. He says, "A spirituality of communion indicates, above all, the heart's desire, the heart's contemplation of the mystery of the Trinity dwelling in us, and whose light we must also be able to see shining on the face of the brothers and sisters around us. Spirituality of communion also means an ability to think of our brothers and sisters in faith within the profound unity of the mystical body, and therefore as those who are part of me. This makes us able to share their joys and sufferings, to sense their desires and attend to their needs, to offer them deep and genuine friendship. A spirituality of communion implies also the ability to see what is positive in others, to welcome it and prize it as a gift from God, not only as a gift for the brother and sister who has received it directly, but also as a gift from me. Spirituality of communion means, finally, to know how to make room for our brothers and sisters bearing each other's burdens and resisting the selfish temptations which constantly beset us and provoke competition, careerism, distrust, and jealousy. It would be difficult to come up with a more comprehensive vision of living in right relationship with others. The Pope invites us, priests, religious, and laity, to contemplate the mystery of the Trinity within our hearts and to discern its presence in those around us. He asks us to be aware of the presence of others, to minister to their needs, and to reach out to them in a spirit of friendship. And doing so means making room for others in our lives and allowing them to make room for us. It means living in communion with them on every level of our human makeup: physical, emotional, intellectual, social, and spiritual. The Pope's words describe a vision of right relationship that few would fault or disavow. Now, most of us have no problem accepting this vision of communion or right relationship. Our trouble is putting it into practice. Walter Principe's distinction comes to mind about the different levels of spirituality: the experiential, the doctrinal, and the analytical. We accept the Church's teaching on the spirituality of communion and can easily accept it as a vision that we should look to and strive to implement in our lives. We can even study, analyze, and criticize it for the purposes of making it a more coherent body of teaching. On the experiential level, however, many of us have a difficult time taking the necessary steps for making this teaching on communion and right relationship an integral part of our lives. We experience a gap between the vision of what we profess to be and desire to become, and who we really are. And that gap can be small or quite large. The size of it determines the degree of dysfunction we experience in our personal, family, and community lives. Now, in a special way, religious are called to be, and I'm quoting from Vita Consecrata, number 46, of John Paul II's apostolic exhortation on the consecrated life. They are called to be, quote, true experts of communion. Our desire for communion stems from our being created in the image and likeness of the mysterious, personal, and yet transcendent ground of love known as the Trinity. Our call comes from Christ himself, who wants us to be one, just as he and his Father are one. Our problem is that, like all human beings, we are fallen, more than a little dysfunctional, somewhat bent out of shape. And at the same time, the imprint of the divinity continues to swell within us and manifest itself in our deep longings. We yearn for communion with one another, ultimately because of God's yearning for communion with us. Although we are miserably out of step with one another, we are still haunted by the deeply rooted hope that things can and will get better. Not through our own doing, but because of the God who made us, loves us, and holds us in being. It is important for those of us who are religious to face the cold, hard truth about ourselves. We will never achieve full communion with ourselves, others, and God, at least in this life. The key question for us is not whether the gap between vision and experience exists in our lives, but whether we recognize it and are taking responsible steps to gradually make it smaller and smaller. We need, in other words, to be able to recognize the gap, accept it as something that will never fully go away, at least in this life, and take appropriate steps to narrow it. This book represents one small attempt to help us do so by refocusing the discussion on the basics of religious life. Chapter 1 enters into the topic through a discussion of the language of conversion. Chapter 2 follows with a discussion of the anthropology of the vows. Chapter 3 examines the call to community. And chapter 4 examines the relevance of the spirituality of communion for religious. Chapter 5 looks at the importance of community structures for fostering a life of virtue. And finally, chapter 6 highlights perseverance as an essential feature of contemporary religious life. Each of these chapters concludes with a series of reflection questions designed to help the reader probe the spirituality of communion more deeply and to find its relevance for religious life today. The closing epilogue, moreover, challenges us to do our part in making religious life what it should be. And the final appendix discusses the ways in which we can speak of the superiority of religious life. The purpose of this book is to root religious life more firmly in its mission of living in communion with God, others, and the world around them. In doing so, it hopes to inspire religious to be a leaven for the world in which they live, so that they may be true messengers of the kingdom that is already in their midst, yet still to come. Although the Catholic Church has a clear and extensive teaching on the spirituality of communion that has concrete implications for religious, The problem we face today has to do with narrowing the gap between what we profess and our actual lived experience. We need, in other words, to take a good, hard look at the discrepancy and try to find a constructive way of dealing with it. The one way of doing so is to adapt the psychological language of action, habit, and attitude to the experience and needs of religious life today. According to this understanding of human behavior, an action involves a single deliberated object and intention, while a good habit, as opposed to an unwanted involuntary habit, refers to an active pattern of behavior required through the continuous repetition of actions. An attitude, in turn, is an active disposition voluntarily acquired through the repetition of options of those fundamental values that are the determining factors in a person's life project. To give you an example, there is a big difference between a person who, out of curiosity, decides to go to Mass on Sunday after being away for 20 or 30 years, a single action, and a person who attends Sunday Mass regularly without giving much thought to it, and does so simply because that was the way he or she was brought up, a good habit. And a person who attends Sunday Mass regularly, not merely out of habit, but because the Eucharist has, over the years, become the central focus of his or her life, a value. But to an external observer, these three people who may happen to be attending the same Sunday Mass would seem by appearances to be doing the very same thing. Their reasons for being there, however, would be very different. The first person's actions would be singular. The second's habitual. The third's attitudinal. An action, in other words, is singular and concrete. A voluntary disposition, a deeply rooted pattern of behavior. An attitude, a deeply ingrained option for a particular set of values. Now, ideally, there exists a strong continuity between a person's actions, good habits, and attitudes. In real life, however, the strength of this continuity can manifest varying degrees of strength and is often even disrupted. The same can be said of the actions, habits, and attitudes of a family, group, or religious community. When applied to religious communities in the light of the Church's teaching on the spirituality of communion and the gap between vision and lived experience, it is of paramount importance that we find a way of helping to shape people's attitudes. And to do so, we must recognize that there exists a circular relationship between the actions, voluntary dispositions, and the formation of attitudes. That is to say that attitudes give rise to various actions and voluntary dispositions and are, at the same time, shaped by them. To overlook these important relationships runs the risk of forming consecrated persons whose actions run contrary to, or at best, are inconsistent with the values they truly hold and which define their life's project. This circular relationship between actions, voluntary dispositions, and attitudes means that religious communities must develop complex strategies for narrowing the gap between vision and lived experience. Such a strategy must involve an ongoing interplay of teachings, structures, practices, and critical reflection that enable a community, both individually and as a group, to wrestle with the vision that defines them, so that it can be continually nuanced and perhaps redefined to express what they truly believe. From there, the community needs to develop concrete structures and practices that will reinforce the values expressed by this defining vision in the daily lives of the members. For the desired attitudes to truly take hold, these structures and practices need to be firm yet flexible, taking into account the three fundamental principles of church teaching of right relationships, the dignity of the human person, the common good, and the virtue of solidarity. In today's world, communities of consecrated life cannot be effective instruments of the spirituality of communion if they do not make great efforts to inculcate these basic values of right relationship in the lives of their members. To do otherwise would be working toward increasing the gap between vision and lived experience rather than narrowing it. A religious institution, we might say, has not only public and private lives, but also a secret life. If in their attempts to narrow the gap between vision and lived reality, communities of consecrated life do not give due consideration to the attitudes behind the various dispositions and actions that they ask of their members, then a dangerous rupture can take place between the public face that they present to the outside world, the private life lived within the community, and the secret life known only to a select few, hidden from its members and institutionally suppressed and even denied. When this occurs, the degree of dysfunction within a community can achieve great intensity and be the cause of great misery for both the members and those they claim to serve. For members to live in right relationship with themselves and others, all the various facets of their life together, public, private, and secret, need to be acknowledged, understood, and dealt with in a mature and responsible way. Otherwise, the gap between vision and lived experience will increase rather than diminish, and the community will be based on an illusion, living in a house of mirrors that thrives on deception and outward appearances. A religious community, in other words, needs to get in touch with its shadow side, the darkened aspects of its lived communal experience that influences its conscious decisions and of which it may be only peripherally aware. Only by acknowledging this dark side, taming it, and befriending it, will a community ever come to understand itself and be able to channel its vast resources in creative and constructive ways. Now, I do not intend to go into specifics about what all this means for the evangelical counsels or life in community. That's why I suggest that you read the book. The Church's teaching on these constituent elements of the consecrated life is clear and has been adequately developed elsewhere. What I will say, however, is that when examining the spirituality of their particular institutes, be it on the universal, provincial, or local levels, religious communities need to look at the various gaps that exist between their vision of the vows and life in community and their lived experience of them. When doing so, they need to determine whether the gap between vision and experience is increasing or decreasing, and whether they are making any visible progress in helping the situation along. The same should also be done for their vision and actual lived experience of their charism, as well as for understanding and practice of spirituality of communion. True experts in communion need to be able to live in the gap so that they will be able to gradually lessen it and one day overcome it. In this respect, both the eschatological and countercultural qualities of consecrated life come to the fore. By recognizing the gap between vision and reality, consecrated persons affirm the already but not yet quality of even the best of human relationships. And by striving to narrow the discrepancy between the two, they affirm God's presence in their midst and give witness to those around them of a life based on values completely oriented toward the realization of the kingdom. This juxtaposition of the eschatological and countercultural qualities that make the consecrated life both a challenge and a consolation to those in search of communion and right relationship with themselves and others and God. In the end, we are faced with some challenging questions and need to be pondered and responded to with due diligence. Are we willing to allow God's Spirit to sweep across the deep, dark waters of our human frailties like a mighty wind so that it can form those bonds of authentic human love that are to be the foundations of the new creation? Are we willing to allow the Spirit to do its work of tearing down the walls of envy, hatred, and jealousy that divide and isolate us so that it can build up a communion of living persons who live and move and have their being in the communion of the living God? Are we willing to put off the old self and put on the new by espousing those attitudes toward one another that are befitting of consecrated persons who are called to be disciples of Christ and true experts of communion? Ultimately, it comes down to a choice, one that has to be made again and again, day after day, in the very warp and woof of life, until we get it right. In closing, I would like to thank again Bishop Timothy Sr., the rector of C.S.R. Seminary, for his gracious words of introduction. I'd like to thank Father Joseph Bongard, the vice rector, for helping me plan this event. Kate Kokolas and the library staff for allowing us to use this lovely setting this evening. Laura Giacchetti, the head of marketing at the seminary, for getting the word out. And Michelle Lesniak, my secretary, for creating the flyer, getting the room ready, and arranging for refreshments. I would also like to thank Jim Harper for keeping an eye on the digital camera. I would also like to thank the staff of New City Press, the publisher of this work, especially Gary Brandel, Jim Weber, Tom Masters, and Julie James for their help in bringing this work to print. New City Press is the publishing arm of the Focolare movement, also known as the Work of Mary. And the spirituality of communion is an essential part of their charism, and it is fair to say that without their continued interest in the topic, this slim little book would never have seen the light of day. I believe that there are some members of this ecclesial movement present in our audience, and I wish to express my heartfelt thanks for their presence and for your presence here this evening. Finally, I would like to remember the person to whom this book is dedicated. My Redemptorist confrere, Father Denis Demco. Denis died on December of 2009 at the young age of 57 after a long, drawn-out struggle with a rare form of dementia, something akin to Alzheimer's disease. He carried his burden bravely and without complaining. I preached at his wake some 3 years ago, and can attest to the fact that despite his slow deterioration of mind and body, he was a faithful priest and religious to the very end, and that he displayed incredible perseverance and patient endurance throughout his long ordeal. Little did I know that some 6 months later, I too would be struck by a serious illness, and that the shadow of death would cross my path as it did his. I have often thought about Denis many times over the past few years and looked to him as an example of someone who trusted in the Lord, carried on, and persevered to the end. I have often wondered why I survived and why he did not. It is impossible to fathom the mind of God or understand his ways. But I believe that the Lord had other plans for Denis, and that he is serving him in the afterlife with the same dedication, perseverance, and stick-to-itiveness that he did during his life on earth, and even more. I also know that wherever he is, Denis is smiling upon us this evening at this presentation of a book dedicated to his name and memory. And I can't say that he loved books. He never was much one for studies. But he was there whenever there was a party or a cause to celebrate, and this evening we are celebrating the presence of the Lord in our lives and the communion we share with him and with each other. Denis and I had and have a lot in common. We were nearly the same age. We share the same first and middle names. We went to seminary together. We were classmates, confreres, friends, even running mates. We were ordained to the priesthood on the same day, May 24th, 1980. We were both called to serve the church as religious in the congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer. As Redemptorists, he served 20 years in Puerto Rico. I served 20 years in Rome. We came back to the States at roughly the same time. We found ourselves serving the Church of Philadelphia. We were both afflicted with serious life-threatening diseases. We both love Jesus Christ and have a deep devotion to our Blessed Mother. We had our differences, to be sure, the biggest of which was that he was a Phillies fan. And I was, and am, a Yankees fan. Don't hold that against me. But we shared a deep and lasting friendship in spite of them. And that friendship was rooted in the Lord. The dedication simply reads, in memory of my classmate, friend, and confrere, Denis Joseph Demco, C.Ss.R., 1952 to 2009. May the Lord bless you, Denis, wherever you are. May he watch over you and grant you eternal rest. May the Lord bless all of us gathered here this evening in our vocations and ministries. May he grant us the courage and grace to persevere to the end, and may he enable us to contemplate the face of Christ in our daily lives, to celebrate what we see, and to espouse the spirituality of communion in all we do. Thank you.